7 men, 7 families, one disease that, for decades, had no name and no way to be seen until it was already too late. 7 men who never lost a fight on the field but lost the one inside their own skulls. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never watch a Sunday hit the same way again. Here's a question nobody wants to answer. What if the game that made these men heroes is the exact same thing that killed them? Not an opponent, not a car crash, not old age. Their own brains turned into something unrecognizable, one violent collision at a time, until the men wearing the helmets weren't fully themselves anymore. We're talking about 7 NFL players. Different decades, different teams, different positions on the field, but every single one of them ended their own life. And every single one of them, when scientists finally cut open what remained, was found to be carrying a disease with a name most fans had never heard of before it started showing up in headlines: chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. There's a chilling detail buried in nearly every one of these stories, a strange choice, a haunting text message, a final act that seems too specific, too deliberate to be a coincidence. One player shot himself in the chest instead of the head, on purpose. Another left a note asking that his brain be studied. A third was found in his truck, having consumed antifreeze, of all things, as if some part of him wanted to make his death slow enough to leave a message behind. These aren't just tragic stories, they're evidence. Each man in his own way became a piece of a puzzle that would eventually force the most powerful sports league on earth to admit something it spent decades denying. Football gave these men everything: the roar of a stadium, a place in history, a version of themselves that felt untouchable. It also, we now know, took something from them so quietly that even the people who loved them couldn't see it happening until it was too late. This is the story of the players football forgot to protect, and the disease that turned Sunday's biggest heroes into some of its most devastating losses. Let's start at the beginning, with the man whose death changed everything. Before we get into the stories, you need to understand the villain of this documentary. It doesn't wear a jersey. It doesn't show up on a highlight reel. It's invisible for years, sometimes decades, until it isn't anymore. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated blows to the head, not just the concussions that get flagged by referees and covered by ESPN. The disease is now believed to be driven largely by the thousands of smaller, subconcussive hits that never make a highlight reel at all. The routine collisions on nearly every single play, hit after hit, season after season, that most fans wouldn't even notice. Here's what makes CTE so uniquely cruel. It cannot be diagnosed while a person is alive. Not with an MRI, not with a CT scan, not with any blood test currently available to doctors. The only way to confirm it, even today, is to examine slices of brain tissue after death, under a microscope, looking for a specific buildup of a protein called tau that clumps and spreads through the brain in a pattern unlike anything else in medicine. That means every single player in this documentary lived with a ticking clock inside his skull that no living doctor could read. The men you're about to meet lived through an era that didn't yet have the language or the will to protect them. And one by one, their brains kept a record that their own minds could never fully explain while they were alive. Let's meet them. Junior Seau. If you know one name on this list, it's this one. Junior Seau wasn't just a great linebacker across 20 seasons with the Chargers, Dolphins and Patriots. He was a force of personality, 12 Pro Bowls, yes, but also a smile that filled a locker room and a foundation that poured money back into his hometown of San Diego. He was the last person anyone imagined ending up in a story like this. On the 2nd of May 2012, Seau died by suicide in his Oceanside home. He was 43. He shot himself in the chest, not the head, a choice that, at the time, some read as arbitrary, but which in hindsight became the first thread in a pattern that would repeat itself again and again in the years that followed. Preserve the brain. Leave something behind for the people who might finally understand. What makes Seau's story ache the most is the distance between what the world saw and what was actually happening. Publicly, he looked like a man enjoying retirement business ventures, photos with fans, that same electric grin. Privately, friends and family watched him grow withdrawn, sleepless and erratic in ways that felt like watching a stranger wear someone they loved. A year before his death, his car went off a cliff near his home. He said it was an accident. Many who loved him now wonder if it was a warning nobody knew how to read. His family donated his brain, and the diagnosis confirmed what almost no one wanted to believe: chronic traumatic encephalopathy, in a man whose entire public identity was built on vitality and warmth. So's death cracked something open in the national conversation: the idea that mental suffering only happens to people who look like they're suffering. CTE doesn't care how loud your laugh is or how many people love you. It attacks the machinery underneath all of that, quietly, for years, until there's nothing left to hold the person together. He wasn't the first player this happened to, he was just the most famous. To understand where it started, we have to go back further to a man who saw it coming and made sure the world would know. Next, Dave Dewison. If Sal's death woke the public up, Dave Dewison's death was the moment CTE sent its clearest message yet. Dewison was a hard-hitting safety on two Super Bowl champions, the 1,985 Bears and the 1,990 Giants, a four-time Pro Bowler in an era that celebrated brutal hits without asking what they cost. After football, he built what looked like a second successful life: food businesses, university boards, and a seat on the NFL's own disability board, reviewing other players' claims that football had left them permanently damaged. But underneath that success, something was unraveling. His memory began failing him in his early 50s far too soon. His temper became unrecognizable. His marriage collapsed. The man who once sat in judgment of other players' brain injury claims was quietly living through the same symptoms himself, without the language to name it. On the 17th of February 2011, Dave Dewison died by suicide at his home in Florida. He was 50. Like so, he shot himself in the chest, but Dewison didn't leave that choice to chance. He left text messages to his family asking explicitly that his brain be sent to researchers studying CTE in former players. Sit with that for a moment. A man in the grip of devastating decline still found the clarity, or maybe the desperation, to turn his own death into evidence. He wanted answers, even if he couldn't have them himself. Researchers at Boston University confirmed advanced CTE consistent with everything his family had watched him become. There's a particular kind of heartbreak in knowing Dewison spent years evaluating other men's pain from a position of institutional power, all while living through a version of that same pain with no diagnosis, no name, no permission to say it out loud. It says something about a culture that taught players pain was something you played through, not something you spoke about, a silence that, for Dewison, only broke after he was gone. Next, Terry Long. Terry Long's story is where this mystery really begins quietly, years before So or Dewison made headlines. Long played offensive guard for the Pittsburgh Steelers through the 1980s, a position defined by collision after collision on nearly every single play. There was no such thing as an easy game for a lineman like Long. After retirement, his life came apart in ways that, at the time, no one connected to football. Bankruptcy, an arson charge. Friends described a man plagued by confusion and depression, a shadow of the disciplined athlete he'd once been. On the 7th of June 2005, Terry Long was found dead in his pickup truck. He was 45. He died by ingesting antifreeze, a slow, agonizing death so unusual that investigators initially weren't even certain it was suicide. We can't know exactly what was happening in his mind that day, but researchers who later studied cases like his describe a pattern. CTE doesn't just bring depression, it brings impaired judgment, impulsivity, a mind no longer reasoning the way it once did. His family allowed Dr. Bennett Omalu, the pathologist, who 2 years earlier had discovered CTE for the first time in Steelers center Mike Webster, to examine his brain. The diagnosis was the same disease. Long's case became only the second documented instance of CTE in an NFL player, proof that Webster's case wasn't a fluke, but the beginning of a pattern. The NFL's own concussion committee publicly disputed the findings. It would take years, and many more deaths before the league could no longer look away. Terry Long died confused and in pain, without the words to describe what was destroying him. But his brain, and Webster's before it, planted the first seeds of a reckoning football still hasn't finished having. Next, Andre Waters. Andre Waters played strong safety for 12 seasons, most memorably with the Philadelphia Eagles, where teammates called him Dirty Waters, not an insult, but a nod to how relentlessly he hit. In the culture of the 80s and 90s, that made him beloved. It also, researchers now believe, made him one of the most at-risk players of his generation. Waters may have suffered somewhere between 15 and 20 concussions over his career, though the real number is likely unknowable. Players hid symptoms or were sent back onto the field before anyone thought to count. Admitting you were hurt in the head could cost you your job. After retiring into coaching, those close to him began noticing memory loss, depression, and mood swings that didn't match the man they remembered. On the 20th of November 2006, Andre Waters was found dead in his Tampa home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 44. Unlike the men who came after him, he shot himself in the head. There was no reason yet for anyone to think the method mattered for science, and yet what remained was still enough for Dr. Omalu to examine, and what he found stunned him. Brain tissue so damaged it resembled that of an 85-year-old man in early Alzheimer's. Waters was 44. Sit with that. A man in what should have been the prime of his middle age carried a brain that looked, under a microscope, twice its actual age. It was no longer possible to call this a fringe issue affecting a few unlucky players. It was systemic, tied to the routine violence of the game itself, on every snap, at every level. Even so, the league's concussion committee kept downplaying the link. It would take several more devastating deaths before that position became impossible to hold. Next, Paul Oliver. Paul Oliver's story is in many ways the hardest to sit with, simply because of how young he was. He played safety for 5 seasons, mostly with the San Diego Chargers after a standout career at Georgia. He wasn't a grizzled veteran carrying 2 decades of accumulated damage. He was still, by any reasonable measure, just getting started. But something had changed in him. His wife would later describe frightening shifts in his behavior, confusion, memory lapses, emotional instability that felt like watching a stranger take over her husband's body. In the moment, it must have felt inexplicable and terrifying. In hindsight, it reads like a textbook description of a brain in decline. On the 24th of September 2013, Paul Oliver died by suicide at his home in Marietta, Georgia, in front of his wife and children. He was 29 years old. 29, an age when most people are still building a life, not ending one. Researchers at Boston University confirmed CTE in his brain, despite a football career a fraction of the length of Sow's or Waters. His case forced open one of the field's most unsettling open questions. Maybe it isn't just about years played or documented concussions. Maybe it's about cumulative, repetitive hits, the kind that start in childhood leagues, long before anyone puts on a professional uniform. By the time Oliver reached the NFL, he'd likely already absorbed over a decade of head trauma. His widow became an advocate afterward, speaking publicly about what she witnessed, determined that his story might spare some other family the same confusion and grief. His death asked a question nobody has fully answered. If a 9-year-old's brain can fail this badly, what does that mean for the children playing tackle football right now, years before they'll ever go pro? Next, Aaron Hernandez. If you know a second name on this list, it's probably this one though, for very different reasons. Aaron Hernandez was a rising star tight end for the New England Patriots, a Super Bowl contributor with a massive contract and seemingly a decade of stardom ahead of him. Then it all came apart. In 2013, he was arrested and later convicted of murdering Odin Lloyd and separately charged and acquitted in a double homicide. His fall from stardom to convicted murderer became one of the most sensational stories in modern sports. On the 19th of April 2017, Hernandez was found dead in his prison cell, having died by suicide. He was 27. He had been acquitted of the double murder charge just days earlier, an outcome he never got to process. What followed his death reshaped the entire conversation around CTE. Researchers at Boston University found stage 3 CTE out of 4 stages, the most advanced case ever documented in someone his age. Dr. Anne McKee, one of the field's leading researchers, noted severe damage to his frontal lobes, the region that governs judgment, impulse control, and aggression. Researchers are careful CTE cannot be used to excuse or fully explain any individual's violent choices. The science doesn't draw a straight line from disease to specific acts. But the presence of such profound damage in someone so young forced an uncomfortable new question into the open. What if some of this disease's damage doesn't turn inward toward despair, but outward toward the people around a person who no longer recognizes his own capacity for harm? Hernandez's case pushed CTE research past grief and into something far more unsettling, and tragically, it wouldn't be the last time. Next, Philip Adams. Every story here has been devastating. This one is different, because it isn't only about a man losing a battle with his own brain, it's about what happens when that battle goes unnoticed by everyone around him for far too long. Philip Adams played cornerback for 6 NFL seasons, bouncing between several rosters after a standout college career at South Carolina State. A journeyman, not a household name, but a man who absorbed the same years of repetitive collisions as everyone else on this list. After retiring, his family watched him change. Mood swings, memory problems, confusion, a growing distance from the people who knew him best. On the 7th of April 2021, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Adams shot and killed 6 people, a local physician and his wife, 2 of their grandchildren, and 2 workers at their home before turning the gun on himself at his parents' house as police closed in. He was 32. This story deserves to be held with real weight, not sensationalized. 6 people with families and futures were taken that day, and nothing here is meant to excuse that. It's meant to help understand how it happened and what, if anything, might have been caught sooner. Neighbors and former teammates described a slow accumulation of small, easy-to-miss warning signs, none alarming enough alone, devastating in hindsight together. Researchers at Boston University found stage 2 CTE among the most severe cases documented in someone his age, with damage concentrated in the regions governing mood and impulse control. It's the question this entire documentary keeps circling back to, in its most painful form: how many warning signs, in how many families, are being mistaken for personal struggle instead of recognized as a disease that medicine still cannot detect in the living? Adams' case is the one that finally forced football and the public to stop treating CTE as a private tragedy and start treating it as what it actually is: a public health crisis with consequences that reach far beyond the men who played the game. Look back at everything you just heard. 7 men, 7 different decades of football, different teams, different positions, different personalities. A relentless linebacker, a calculating defensive back who left a message for science, an offensive lineman who died in a truck, a hard-hitting safety whose brain looked 85 years old, a young defensive back who died in front of his own family at 29, a Super Bowl tight end who spiraled into murder before taking his own life at 27, a journeyman cornerback whose final act took 6 other lives before his own at 32. 7 wildly different men, one disease found in every single brain researchers examined. If you take one thing away from this documentary beyond the 7 stories themselves, let it be this: the families in every single case we just covered have said some version of the same thing. They saw the changes. They just didn't know what they were looking at. Researchers and advocacy groups who work directly with former players and their families have identified a cluster of warning signs that tend to show up again and again in cases later confirmed to involve CTE. Unexplained, escalating irritability, or explosive anger in someone who wasn't like that before. Memory lapses that go beyond normal forgetfulness, losing track of conversations, appointments, or even familiar routes. Withdrawal from friends, family, and activities the person used to love. impulsive decisions, financial or otherwise, that seem wildly out of character, depression that doesn't respond the way you'd expect to typical treatment or support, and, in the most severe cases, sudden preoccupation with death or specific detailed talk about how they might end their own life. None of these signs on their own prove someone has CTE. Plenty of people experience some of these symptoms for entirely different reasons, and it's not something that can be assumed or diagnosed by friends or family. But taken together, especially in a former football player, especially when the changes represent a real departure from who that person used to be, advocates say these are patterns worth taking seriously and worth pushing that person toward real medical and psychological support rather than waiting for things to improve on their own. If this story opened your eyes, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. The more people understand the hidden cost of football, the more we can push for better player safety and mental health support. And tell me in the comments which NFL story should I cover next.